Hello, everybody. Can everybody take their seats, please? We're going to get started very promptly at 3:30 for this 11th out of 23 of the Conservative Environment Network events at Conservative Party Conference this year, titled Beaver Fever, Why Has Rewilding Caught the Public's Imagination? I'm James Cullimore. I lead the Natural Environment Programme here at the Conservative Environment Network. And for those who aren't familiar with CEN, we're the independent forum for Conservatives who believe in net zero, nature restoration and resource security. And you can find our full events programme on the leaflets on your chair or by visiting our website. Thank you in particular to Chester Zoo for enabling us to put on this event today. I'm going to kick off with a little bit of context. I'm then going to go to my panelists for some opening remarks, 3 minutes each, please. I will then ask a couple of questions from the chair, and then we'll go to you guys for your questions. So please be thinking about your questions while the panelists are delivering their remarks and be ready to ask them. Please keep them brief. We want questions and not statements. But firstly, I'm going to kick off with a little bit of context for today's discussion. The UK is one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. We've lost more of our biodiversity than any other nation in the G7. And the decline of nature affects us all because it reduces the ability of nature to provide the services upon which we all depend, to absorb carbon to regulate our climate, to provide us with food and to clean our air and water. Globally, the loss of these ecosystem services is costing us roughly around 10% of global GDP. And the Dasgupta review into the economics of biodiversity, published last year and commissioned by the UK Treasury, found that the cost of inaction greatly outweighs the cost of restoring our broken ecosystems. So, and as Conservatives, we recognise our obligations to future generations, and we intrinsically understand that we are the temporary custodians of a unique natural inheritance, and we have a duty to pass it on to future generations in a better condition than we found it. And so that was the context behind Boris Johnson's speech at Conservative Party conference last year when he called on the country to build back beaver. And since then, rewilding has gone mainstream. But today we want to dig a little bit deeper and try and work out, well, what exactly does this term, what does this concept mean? What are some of the challenges associated with creating a wilder Britain? What do we mean by species reintroductions? What are some of the social and ecological benefits of reintroducing keystone species such as the beaver? But what are some of the challenges and conflicts? Particularly, how do we bring farmers with us on this journey? So to answer those questions, we've got a fantastic set of panelists for you. And I'm going to turn, first of all, to Ruth Edwards MP, MP for Rushcliffe, and a member of the Conservative Environment Network Parliamentary Caucus. And since becoming an MP, Ruth has been one of the leading advocates for the natural environment in Parliament. So Ruth, over to you.
James, thank you so much. Well, it's a pleasure to be here today. I have to say, of all the stories from conference that I thought would end up on the Guido Fawkes blog, I didn't think it would be a CEN panel on Beaver Fever. I was momentarily concerned, James, I'd signed up for something far more salacious than species reintroduction, but I'm pleased that that's not the case. It's also great to have Chester Zoo co-hosting the event and to have Simon here. I was really lucky to be able to visit Chester Zoo earlier this year and hear about the fantastic work they're doing with restoring habitats, both here in the UK, but also overseas as well. In terms of, I've been asked to speak a bit today about how rewilding and nature restoration is viewed by my constituents and by the farming community in Rushcliffe. And I would say there's a mixed approach. So there is a lot of strong support for rewilding. And in Rushcliffe, we've been rewilding long before it became fashionable. We have a beautiful country park, Cockgrave Country Park, which has been sort of developed on the old colliery spoil heaps there and now has beautiful woodlands, lake, and is absolutely gorgeous. But we also there is a bit of apprehension as well in some communities because people think, not correctly, but people are worried that the government is trying to take productive agricultural land out of food production and to grow trees on it. And that's one of the things I hear from people quite often. I think part of this was from the misunderstanding that when the BPS fund was split between the 3 pillars of ELMS, that it was going to be split equally 3 ways, and so that landscape recovery, which is going to have about 10 or 15 pilots and be focused on rewilding, was going to have the same funding as something like the Sustainable Farming Initiative, which the government is hoping about 70–75% of farmers are going to sign up to. That is not the case, and it was always going to be demand-led, but I certainly think that that hasn't helped. And I do think because of that, there is a risk that rewilding becomes a term that alienates a lot of people. And yet, as James has just said, you know, we desperately need to restore our biodiversity everywhere, and also not just at specific sites. We've had a 41% decline in our species since 1970. We're one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world, as he's said. And food production itself relies on biodiversity for a variety of food plants, pollination, pest control, nutrient provision. Medicinal plants and manufactured pharmaceuticals rely on biodiversity as well. So how can we take people along with us? Well, I think the first thing we need to emphasize is that restoring nature is something that can work alongside other activities. So landscape recovery projects are brilliant. I'm sure we're going to hear more about quite a few of them today, and they're the ones that really capture people's imagination. But we also need to translate those into projects that can be rolled out across many more places in the country. This needs to be something that everybody can take part in. We need to integrate nature restoration into other ways of using land. So one quite good example we have of this at the moment is the Countryside Stewardship Scheme. And that's very popular with a lot of farmers in Rushcliffe. Most of them are on it. They take part in things like the winter bird food package, and those that have seen a huge increase in the variety and number of bird species on their farms. I also have farmers creating wetlands through natural ways of holding water on their land. Really rich wildlife areas are created, and it also does a lot to help prevent local flooding. And I think we've seen about a 40% uptake on the country's 40% increase, in the uptake of the Countryside Stewardship Scheme this year. I'm also very keen on an idea put forward by the Wildlife Trust, which is around Wild Belt, a Wild Belt designation to provide long-term protection for land that's been managed for nature's recovery, to help us create connected corridors, making sure that wildlife and the natural environment have space and the time they need to flourish. And we could do these in small parcels of land, alongside road verges, river valleys, sections of parks. Secondly, I think this needs to be something that we do in partnership with communities rather than something that communities feel is being done to them. And I think that's particularly important with the species reintroduction. And we've seen some really good examples of that with the beaver reintroductions that we've had. And then the third and final thing is that I'd like to see an end to this false dichotomy, which is used by some figures, not all, but some, on both sides of the argument. One side of the argument says that rewilding and biodiversity is much more important than food, and the other side says food is king and nothing else matters. We need food to survive, we need trees to survive. Sustainable, productive food production relies on abundant biodiverse ecosystems. So we need to incentivize methods of food production that work with nature, that encourage biodiversity. We need to embrace rewilding projects on areas of land that are not high-grade productive agricultural land. Restoring peatlands, for example, will provide improved habitats for many species and a brilliant carbon sink. Reintroducing beavers, got to give a shout out to the beavers, can bring benefits to both flood and drought mitigation, provided they're released in suitable locations, which is what the licence process is designed to do. So in short, there's a lot of good stuff going on, even more to do, and positive progress will come with better engagement and a willingness to listen to the concerns of local communities and work with them rather than encouraging confrontation.
Thank you ever so much, Ruth, and a really important plea there to move past the polarisation that's come to characterise some of this debate and the importance of bringing local communities along with us. I'm now going to turn to Benedict Mcdonald, a British conservationist, writer and former television producer. He's now the head of nature restoration at Rewilding Estates, and Benedict is also the inaugural winner of the Wainwright Prize for Global Conservation for his book, Rewilding. Benedict, over to you.
Thank you. Privileged to be here. Thank you for having me. So I've been a lifelong naturalist. My father taught me the birds and butterflies of the UK when I was 5, 6 years old, and have grown up in a country that even in my relatively short 34-year-old lifetime has become even more shockingly depleted of nature than when I was born. I have watched cuckoos, willow tits, turtle doves all vanish almost in front of my eyes and gone through my diaries for many years thinking, where has the wildlife gone? So I committed quite early on that I wanted a career of helping wildlife back, which began with working on the David Attenborough conservation series, because I believe education and showing and demonstration and inspiration are absolutely critical ingredients when it comes to restoring the natural world, as opposed to, for example, bashing people over the head and telling them what they shouldn't be doing. But it became abundantly clear to me that the irony of visiting places, pristine ecosystems in Alaska, in Venezuela, in Colombia, in Peru, and coming back to a country that, whilst culturally rich and sociologically rich and fantastic buildings, art galleries, institutions, NHS, is ecologically intensely degraded, which as somebody very proud to live in this country is a matter of great shame and a matter of enormous economic loss and social loss to the UK, not merely ecological loss. We are by far the worst in Europe by many indicators: farmland birds, the rate at which we've restored wildlife in this country, and our understanding of the economic importance that the natural world has. It's not just for fluffy guardianistas living in the cities. If you have beavers on your land in the last few months, you will not have experienced a drought. It is that profound. So it became clear to me that I needed to do more than make admittedly very well-watched and famous television programs. So in 2014, I began work on my first book, Rewilding, which took a very long view, by which I mean the last 100,000-year view of where wildlife has gone in the UK. And we've actually a fairly shocking history of de-wilding and removing our native ecosystems with a great deal of extra zeal compared to some of our European neighbours. And perhaps that isn't something we should be particularly proud of. But fundamentally, we also have an incredibly exciting future now of being the generation able to put it back for the good of all society, not merely people like myself who enjoy viewing and watching wildlife as an innate privilege. So off the back of Rewilding, there was some very significant interest from landowners, NGOs, farmers, various policies were rewritten. I was invited to various boards like the National Trust to advise on what would Britain look like if we actually begun to restore wildlife with the same vision and aspiration and investment that we do our cultural sites, our art galleries, our road networks. What would happen if the Somerset Levels became a biosphere for the lost Dalmatian pelicans that we used to have? What would happen if we took a more visionary approach to our grouse moors and our deer estates, the 16% of Britain that do not produce food and therefore could have some really visionary outcomes for the natural world? And what would happen if we put insect recovery at the heart of regenerating our farmland ecosystems so we can actually produce more food, not less, long into the future? In 2020, then, I met an eco-entrepreneur, Julian Matthews, and together we have set up the Rewilding Estates Company. We are a private conservation business, which is something of a novelty in the UK, where conservation has, until very recently, been led, or publicly led at least, by NGOs, and there's nothing wrong with that. But we work predominantly with landowners to help restoring nature, make them a profit. And we're not ashamed of that, because if you can't make a profit, you make a loss. If you make a loss, your estate or your farm goes under, you can't hand it down to the next generation, and we will see the continued rural depopulation that we have seen in this country for many, many decades. The countryside isn't being killed by George Monbiot riding into Wales on a giant rewilded elephant. It's been killed because the farming methods we have embraced are unsustainable, both economically and socially. In the 1800s, Wales 88% of people working the land, 88% of people employed or working in Wales were working in farmland. Today, 1.8% of the Welsh farm 88% of its land, and that figure drops each year. So we have a duty to re-people as well as rewild, and for me, the two go hand in hand. At Real Wild Estates in the last year, we've seen an exponential growth to managing 60,000 acres. We expect to be managing in excess of 100,000 acres for landowners, farmers, by the end of next year. And there's been an enormous demand for restoring land from the full spectrum, all the way from the NEP type full rewilding projects, all the way to regenerative and more sustainable farming. So that's what I now do for a job. We're private sector conservationists, and it's a great privilege to be here.
Fantastic. Thank you, Benedict, for setting out where we are, but what a vision for a rewilded future might look like. I'm now going to turn to Abby Kane, who is the chief reporter for the Farmers Guardian, for her perspective on the debate around rewilding and how we bring the farming community with us. Abby, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the invitation. So before we get into the meat of this, I think it's just important that we define exactly what we mean by rewilding, because it's quite a loose term that is interpreted differently by a lot of people. For farmers, they probably think about it in three different ways. So the first is the idea of giving over vast swathes of land to rewilding, particularly in the uplands, and removing any kind of land management. The second is the idea of species reintroduction. And the third is more along the lines of wild farming, so giving over a bit of farming land to nature, perhaps in the less productive field margins, letting hedges grow thicker, or even planting trees as part of an agroforestry approach. So looking at those definitions and how farmers might view them, I just want to stress at this point that I've been given the burden of speaking for the farming community, and it is not one homogenous block. Everybody will have different views, but I think what I'm about to say would probably chime with most of our readership. So number one, giving over vast swathes of the uplands over to rewilding. Farmers are really, really concerned about this. They're concerned about rural communities and that invaluable cultural heritage will be erased from the hills and uplands if an approach like this is taken. So once you lose a flock of hefted sheep, it's quite difficult to revive that. There's also a worry about loss of biodiversity, ironically. So it's common now to hear people refer to our uplands as sheep-wrecked, and we've heard a lot about how this country is nature depleted. But the reality is that our uplands are full of biodiversity. So in England, they're home to 53% of the country's sites of special scientific interest. Managing land in the uplands is also massively reduces the risk of wildfires because it keeps fuel loads low. So without grazing, we'd be much more likely to see an increase in these catastrophic events that wipe out plants, wildlife, and damage peatlands. Number two then, species reintroduction. What we're here to discuss today, really. Farmers want biodiversity, they need it, they love it because they love nature for nature's sake, but also because they rely on it for their livelihoods. Many are already doing work to build populations of farmland birds like lapwings, or are moving to more sustainable production methods, even without government support. So you only have to look at the regenerative farming movement to see that's very much farmer-led. On specific species like the beaver, the position is probably nuanced. So, of course, we've heard they help to reduce water pollution, alleviate flooding, and they can sequester carbon in their dams. But the Scottish experience shows that there are drawbacks for farmers too. So particularly those living in arable areas close to the River Tay, for example, they reported that beavers have damaged important drainage channels and undermined bankings. There was one farmer in the Times, I think yesterday, who was saying he spends £4,000 a year repairing that damage. So in places where damage like that can occur and where mitigation measures don't work, I think most farmers would want licensed lethal control to remain on the table as an option of last resort. The reintroduction of other apex predators like lynx and wolves probably almost universally be opposed by the farming community for fairly obvious reasons. The third kind of rewilding then, which may be better described as wilder farming, I think that'd probably be welcomed by most farmers. As I mentioned, a lot of them are already farming this way, trying new approaches that work for their specific circumstances. And the new environmental land management scheme, if it remains in place, which we're told that it will by the new DEFRA team, is likely to accelerate the pace of change. But, and this is a really big but, that's only if it's properly funded. So payment rates have only been published for a limited amount of standards under the Sustainable Farming Incentive, which is the first component of ELM. and they're not encouraging, to be honest. Upland farmers don't even have any suitable options to apply for at all at the moment. So my message would be, if the government is serious about improving the environment and boosting food production, it needs to put its money where its mouth is.
Fantastic. Thank you, Abby, and thank you for making the really important point that farmers are our environmental stewards, and given they manage 70% of the land in this country, there is no solution to the nature or the climate challenge that does not involve farmers and have the farming community at its heart. I'm now going to turn, finally, to Dr. Simon Dowell, who is the Conservation Science and Policy Director at Chester Zoo. Simon, over to you.
Thank you very much. And can I just first say we're absolutely delighted that Chester Zoo's sponsoring this event today. And thank you very much for inviting me to be on the panel. And like my fellow panel members, I've had a long-standing interest in wildlife in the countryside, and I've had the good fortune to include it as part of my career, teaching and researching it in a couple of academic institutions before moving to Chester Zoo to be the Conservation Science and Policy Director. And the UK zoos are conservation powerhouses and at the forefront of nature recovery in the UK, as well as internationally, because good zoos have professionally planned, science-led conservation at their core. And we're more relevant in the fight to prevent extinction now than ever before. So we're in a unique position because we provide a lifeline for threatened species in our care. We protect and restore wild habitats. We're fostering deep and lasting connections with nature amongst the public and inspiring the next generation of conservationists. And Chester Zoo is a leading conservation education charity with a mission to prevent extinction, both here in the UK and across the world. And we work with over 100 partners in more than 20 countries to recover threatened wildlife and restore habitats. So our reach and influence extends well beyond our site in Chester. But we're very active in helping to restore native species and recover wildlife around our site in Chester. On our 200-acre estate, we've created extensive new wildflower meadows and wetlands on previously monoculture farmland. And this has culminated in huge increases in biodiversity. And they include things like harvest mice, which are now thriving after we reintroduced them 20 years ago. And so we're now extending this to our Nature Recovery Corridor, which is funded by the government's Green Recovery Challenge Fund. And eventually this will cover a 10-mile stretch between Chester and Ellesmere Port, connecting habitats and turning the area into a thriving example of what British nature can be, with the local community's involvement all the way. Now, the government's 25-year environment plan recognises that one of the key roles zoos and aquariums perform is managing populations of threatened species in captivity for return to the wild. But the process of returning species to the wild is far from straightforward, and it requires complex scientific, collaborative, and multidisciplinary approaches involving specialised knowledge. And the zoo community, with its unique combination of expertise in animal welfare and husbandry, applied science, and extensive collaboration, are crucial and instrumental in establishing this knowledge base and developing international standards. And research from the British and Irish Association of Zoos and Aquaria have found that there are at least 76 animal and plant species native to the UK and its overseas territories, which British zoos and aquariums are actively helping to restore, and many through introductions, reintroductions, and translocations. And these include iconic animals like wildcats in Scotland and pine martins in Wales, birds like corncrakes and choughs, and of course zoos are actively involved in reintroductions of long extinct formerly native species, of which of course beavers are one, and white storks is another exciting example. Now, discussions of rewilding usually focus on the charismatic mammals and birds, and I'm sure we're going to be talking a lot more about that today. But I just want to sing the praises of some of the scores of plants and invertebrates and smaller species that support the ecosystems and ecological services on which we all depend. And here zoos can help too. At Chester Zoo, we're working with an increasing number of insect and plant species in order to contribute to ecosystem restoration in northwest England and North Wales. For example, in collaboration with the Lancashire Wildlife Trust, we're helping to restore lowland peat bogs by returning locally extinct components of these ecosystems. Things like large heath butterflies, sundews, and the bog bush cricket as well. And this is supported by the unique skills of our staff and these vital components of these peatlands are unlikely to return on their own. So conservation zoos like ourselves are playing a big role towards achieving the government's biodiversity targets. And as leading conservation charities, it's essential that we play an active role in standing up for biodiversity in our environment, both locally and internationally. So we welcome the 25-year Environment Plan and the subsequent Environment Act. These were great steps in the right direction. We really hope that the information we've heard recently about the environmental land management schemes doesn't mean that this scheme is about to be watered down. We think that this is really important for what we're discussing today in terms of rewilding. And we'll be keeping an eye on developments over the coming weeks, and we look forward to being able to influence that in a more positive direction. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Simon. Right, I'm going to ask a couple of questions myself, and then I'm going to come to the audience. So if you could have your questions at the ready, I'll take them in batches of 3 and try to get through as many as possible. But firstly, I'd like to pick up that last point that Simon made around our new environmental land management schemes. Now, this is the change to farm payments that we're making and we're undertaking outside of the European Union. Now we're free from the Common Agricultural Policy. And it's important for context that in most cases we're not talking about rewilding in terms of restoring functioning ecosystems. We're talking about integrating nature into the farmed landscape and other productive land uses like forestry. Ruth, how important are these new schemes that the government are bringing developing? How important are they for supporting farmers on this transition? And do you think there is still a role, you mentioned landscape recovery in your remarks, do you think that we should be keeping that third tier of elms? And how do you see the budget being split between those schemes in the future?
So yeah, look, I think we definitely need to keep that third tier of elms, but we also need to have, we need to be realistic that the majority of funding and the majority of farmers are going to be looking at something like the Sustainable Farming Initiative, which is about farming in a nature-friendly and sustainable way. So we need to make sure that part of the scheme that we are developing is working for the farming community. At the moment, I hear a lot from farmers in Rushcliffe that it seems a bit bureaucratic, it seems pretty complicated. They're worried about whether they are going to get the level of compensation that they need through that to make their business viable. So, of course, it's right that as it is being rolled out, government is looking at it and looking at it with farmers, because if we don't get it right, farmers aren't going to take it up. Food prices are high at the moment, so instead of taking that up, they will just maximise the production out of the land. And that's what a lot of people are saying to me they're going to do at the moment. So I do think it's important that we review it sensibly. We have to, it's designed for the farming community. We have to take them along with us.
Thank you, Ruth. Abby, in terms of that review of the environmental land management schemes, what do you think the government could do to, for example, boost farmer uptake, as Ruth was stressing?
I think number one, you've got to keep it simple. And number two, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, you've got to make sure that the payment rates are, they're attractive to farmers. You know, at the moment, I've been speaking to farmers, as Ruth says, who have been ploughing up land that's been in stewardship for 20 years because they think that by intensifying production, they'll be able to make more money than by joining the SFI. And that's not a good outcome for anyone. I think we've also got to make it more accessible for people. So there are very limited options for grassland. I keep hearing again and again that DEFRA doesn't understand the importance of permanent pasture. Some of the standards that are out at the moment are mainly focused on arable soils, to be fair. So yeah, I think there are a few things that can make a difference.
Fantastic, thank you. And Benedict, I want to come to this question of land use change, because as we've said, most of the farmed landscape will remain in food production. That's absolutely right for our food security, of course. But as Henry Dimbleby pointed out in his food strategy, the least productive 20% of land in this country contributes around 3% of our calories. So we do have space to accommodate some land use change for nature and for climate mitigation. Could you set out some more of that context and what that might look like, and perhaps how the government can support that and manage that?
Of course, I think the problem with a lot of these discussions is they become extremely general. If you're going to put nature somewhere, it has to be somewhere. It has to be in a physical place. So the question is, what are the physical places in the UK, the acreage that lends itself to what you might call full whack ecosystem restoration? But firstly, why do we need ecosystem restoration? Well, almost every other country has large areas of nature which sequester carbon, protect that country against climate change, literally change the weather and create the rain, and we don't. So we are climatically stuffed, and we're stuffing our children if we don't put those large areas of woodland, native woodland, not plantation conifer, back into the UK. So the question then is, where should they go? Well, my view is we should not be rewilding productive arable land, but we need to ask ourselves what productive means. There are vast swathes of Western England and Wales that are deemed agriculturally very unfavourable. Ben Goldsmith and others have been excellent on this on social media in pointing out that they exist only on subsidy, which we and me, the taxpayer, fund, and they deliver outcomes that include downstream flooding, through the complete absence of tree cover on many hillsides in Wales and Western England. Now, that is not something we morally should be paying for in this country in an age of climate change. But we also forget that as you go into northern England and Scotland in particular, on grouse moors and deer estates, we have 16% of Britain that has never ostensibly in the recent past produced significant quantities of British food. So we need to be quite analytical in which areas of the UK are making any meaningful contribution to calorific diet before we can start talking about whether they are productive farmland or not. So the fallacy often underlying the question of why are we rewilding productive farmland, well, nobody's suggesting that. What we're suggesting is a much more critical analysis, like you would do with any other business, of is this suitable land to farm with sheep in the 21st century when the imperative is carbon sequestration, climate change prevention, and dealing with flood and dealing with drought, which doesn't just affect farmers but affects every single human being in the rural community, many of whom, of course, are not farmers, they're vets, they're teachers, they're people with other professions, but whose houses in Cumbria are still getting flooded nonetheless because we are paying to keep the hills predominantly treeless in many cases. So I think it's absolutely right that the elms should remain ecologically ambitious because we have centuries of damage to repair. And if we want to be able to farm the land into the future, you have to look at the average age of many hill farmers unable to hand land down to the next generation. And I think this is what this has to be about. It has to be about the next generation, being able to farm the land sustainably and productively. In Eastern Europe, many countries that we might consider to be backward, to put it bluntly, in their farming methods, are actually much more prepared for climate change than we are. Steep hillsides are predominantly wooded, animals are grazed within woodland, a system known as wood pasture, silviculture, and the orchard landscapes that once dominated large areas like Herefordshire would be wisely reinstated in large parts of the country. We often see a false dichotomy between livestock, particularly cattle, and trees, but cattle, of course, are a woodland species that do extremely well within heavily wooded environments. So the question I always ask is, why does a field have to remain a field? Why couldn't it be an orchard simultaneously producing fruit, timber, sequestering carbon, and grazing animals in the same place?
Fantastic, thank you, Benedict. I'm going to turn to Abby. So that's the question for you, Abby. How do we integrate these to deliver multiple outcomes within our landscape, in particular our uplands, where there is a challenge around the profitability of sheep farming, and there's this plan to repurpose the farm budget to purchase public goods like flood mitigation and carbon sequestration. How can we integrate all of these outcomes into our upland landscapes?
I think that elm goes a good way towards doing that, and it's the right direction of travel, but you need to make those options available for upland farmers. But just to pick up on the point that was just made, looking at it from a business perspective, we need to remember that these are people who are living in the hills, and it's not all old farmers who are looking to pass on the land to the next generation, and they don't all want to be park keepers. They want to produce food. That's what they've done, and there's so much culture involved in that as well. So I just think we ignore that at our peril. We need to make sure that rural communities are at the heart of any changes that we make.
Fantastic, thank you. And finally, before I go to the audience, Simon, we've spoken about beavers, but what other species are on the cards in terms of native reintroductions?
Well, I'm going to speak up for some of the smaller species, as I did in my opening remarks. We hear a lot about the larger, ecosystem engineers like beavers, and they're extremely important, and certainly some of the grazing animals as well. But our ecosystems in the UK, or our remaining habitats, are now so fragmented and so depleted that actually, if we're going to create these exciting new environments through schemes like ELMS and others, then we're going to have to physically bring some of these species back. So, for example, at Chester Zoo, we've started working on adders. Adders used to be a very common snake in the UK, one of the few reptiles that we have, one of the 6 native species, now really declining. We're also working with a lot of butterflies, things like large heath that I mentioned earlier, grayling butterflies. We're working with some of the freshwater species, such as the scarce yellow stonefly, which was recently rediscovered in the River Dee. And these are all important components of ecosystems that we need to bring back along with the larger, more charismatic species.
Fantastic, thank you. Right, over to audience questions. Who's got the microphone? Jack at the back. Right, we're going to start, Jack, if we can, at the front right. We've got some questions here. So we'll start with Jay Porter.
Thank you very much. Councillor Jay Porter from Staffordshire Moorlands. In Staffordshire Moorlands, we've got a project called the Wilder River Turnip Project to improve water quality, prevent flooding and restore nature. And obviously, that's going to have huge benefits for our local area. But to my question, what more can we do to promote the economic and health benefits of nature restoration for local communities? Because we keep talking about the environmental benefits, but we're not talking enough about the economic and health benefits.
Thank you, and
Thank you very much. Andy Hoare, the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. Going back to Benedict's point about this happening in places, can the government be providing some strategic energy to the rewilding movement by prioritising places? We've heard the levels mentioned, the uplands mentioned, but I'm also thinking of places like the UK's national parks. What places should be prioritised as sites of rewilding?
And one more question. Yes, the lady there, thank you.
Hello, hi, Harriet Gould, South Cambridgeshire. I heard you said that government are still providing funding for things, and there's a Twitter hashtag that says attack on nature, and it seems like the whole of the Wildlife Trust fraternity and all the environmentalists are talking about this, and I wondered if you had any comments on that and if you had any idea how we can counter that.
Fantastic. Thank you. Ruth, why don't I come to you first, in particular that last question.
Yeah, sure. So look, I can see Bill Wigan at the back of the room laughing at me here. Look, I think the organisations who have perpetuated that attack on nature hashtag and statement need to ask themselves some very serious questions about what they're trying to achieve. If they're trying to achieve a membership drive where they get lots of people to sign up and donate more money to them, then I reckon that worked pretty well. If they're trying to present themselves as serious organisations that want to engage properly in what is a nuanced and difficult debate, then I think it's been an abject failure. As somebody who has worked very closely with organisations like the RSPB, I've hosted events for them in Parliament, I am deeply, deeply disappointed with the way that they have acted. What has the government actually said? It said we're going to review ELMS to make sure that it's suitable for farmers, that farmers are actually going to take it up. As we've just been discussing here today, there are some things we need to tweak with it. If we don't, then we won't see the number of farmers we need to take it up. There's no point in having a policy that everybody in Westminster loves if the people it's designed for don't actually want to take part in it. We're not going to end up restoring our natural world if people aren't getting involved with things like SFI. Okay, so that's another thing. The second thing they've said is we're going to look at lots of EU law. It's all been, moved over into UK law. We're going to see what it is we retain. We're going to see as is. We're going to look at what we're going to sunset completely, and we're going to look at what we're going to change. Well, we've all just been discussing today how we are one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. Who can possibly say that the current regulations we have around habitats and things like that are working so brilliantly, there is no way we could improve them? So I think we really, in the last 2.5 years as an MP, I have dealt with more actual crises than I would expect to face in about 2.5 decades. So I think, could we please stop manufacturing crises of our own creation? Let us wait and see what actually comes out. Of course, if stuff comes out that is detrimental to the brilliant work this government has done so far. I will have something to say about it. I imagine a lot of the 100 or so Conservative MPs in the Sen caucus will have something to say about it, but that is not something they have said yet. The only other thing I would say, and this is feedback for colleagues in DEFRA, if anyone is in the room, please do not lob potentially politically very sensitive high lines like reforming planning, reforming habitats into the air and let people fill in the details themselves, because it is human nature to fill in the worst case scenario, and that is what has happened here.
Simon, I'd like to come to you with Joe's question. The first question on talking about the economic and societal benefits of nature recovery. I mean, zoos do a lot of great work in terms of engaging nature on the importance of environmental protection and educating the public about not just wildlife in this country, but the wildlife across the world. How can we talk more about the economics and the societal benefits?
Yes, thank you. Chester Zoo is the second most visited visitor attraction, paid for visitor attraction in the UK. Just before COVID, we were up to 2 million visits a year, and we're getting on for that now this year again. So the reason why I mentioned that is because at Chester Zoo, we are a wildlife attraction. So we're not a theme park, we don't have rides. People come because they want to see animals, they want a nice environment, and they come to hear about wildlife. And I think that demonstrates just what a draw wildlife is and just how popular wildlife is. And therefore, the potential for tourism, ecotourism and visitation, if we actually have a bit more vision around our wildlife in the UK and some of the things that Ben talks about in his book, I think is enormous. And we know that from just some of the places that we have in the UK already where people go to see wildlife. For example, I've been twice recently to the Isle of Mull, during lockdown and during the COVID pandemic when we couldn't travel abroad, made me think about where can I see wildlife in my own country. And Mull is a fantastic place, and tourism is thriving there largely because of the wildlife, because of course of seagulls and golden eagles and cetaceans and many great things that you can see there. So I think there's an enormous potential. And also just before COVID, we had an assessment of the value of the zoo to our local economy. And that revealed a GVA of 93 million in 1 year, in 2019. So it just really shows you the economic importance of wildlife. And I'd just like to respond quickly to Ruth, because we did actually sign up to a letter that appeared in one of the newspapers this morning. So I do think, I'm very encouraged to hear what you say, but I do think the mood music appears to have changed recently, and that's why wildlife organisations, conservation organisations are very concerned and are, standing together. We've got things like fracking coming back in. We've got concerns about ELMS, which we've talked about, investment zones removing some of the planning restrictions. So we're worried. I'm very encouraged to hear what you say, and I know that there are a lot of very supportive MPs, and we are very supportive of the Environment Act and some of the provisions that have come out of that. But we're also worried too, and I think it's good to hear that MPs like yourself do support these initiatives.
And just on the second question around what places should be prioritised, Benedict, very briefly, there was a review that the government commissioned, led by Julian Glover, which looked into our national landscapes, our national parks and areas of outstanding natural beauty. Now, we often think of these as being places to escape into the natural environment, places that we go on holiday and where we walk and we spend time in nature. But unfortunately, the state of biodiversity in many of these places is poor and continues to decline. And one of the recommendations in that review, which the government said they're going to take forward, is a new duty on national parks to recover nature. Do you welcome that, and do you urge the government to bring that forward?
Yeah, I do. But I think we also need to take the emphasis in conservation off government somewhat. All I've been hearing today is about subsidies and schemes, but we mustn't forget that entrepreneurship in private landowners, have created us extraordinary stately homes, incredible lawns, mazes, all of these fantastic places that we can visit if we could, go to a National Trust estate, for example. And all of my clients are entrepreneurial farmers and landowners. They are forward-thinking, and they are trying to get on with restoring nature on their land. And often we are able to innovate many income sources that are entirely separate from the likes of countryside stewardship or ELMS. We're talking combinations of extensive grazing meat sales. We're talking ecotourism, real estate optimization. The carbon market is going to be a very important player in this as well. And I think it's important to remember that, landowners and farmers are not really kind of passive recipients of state handouts, and therefore the honest answer is, where can nature restoration happen? It happens anywhere that you can have efficacy and commitment and skill and landowners and farmers and gamekeepers who really want it to happen. But often one of the greatest blockers, and this comes back to Ruth's point, is the legislation that protects nature, which a lot of the NGOs are behind and I am not behind, is very different to legislation that frees up the restoration of nature. For example, the greatest bane of my life is the SSSI, because it tells me here's a little zoo for a particular species that has to be kept in a state of ecological stasis because somebody in the 1980s decided that this landscape was of optimal value to the natural world. When you take a conservationist from Alaska or Finland and they look at it and laugh and say, no, that's just a bit of heather. Where are the mosaic habitats? Where are the diversity of species, the full kind of raucous buzz of millions of bees? So I think we need to free up landowners and farmers to innovate and give them space to use their considerable intelligence to wheel out life all across the UK, not only in our national parks, but on our larger farmed estates, and not, criticise them if they want to do food, but also not criticise them if they want to restore nature, because we need a lot of food, but we also need a lot of nature back. And, many of the most inspirational people I work with are farmers and landowners looking to the next generation. We need to cut the red tape and allow innovation back into the countryside.
Fantastic, thank you. Right, back to the audience for your questions. Yes, the lady on the end of the row here.
Hello there, Dr. Alexandra Trevenant. I'm a paddy dive master, so I know you've been talking about the land, but obviously I've had the pleasure of diving in Plymouth in the last few years, and there's no doubt the increase of seagrass down there has increased biodiversity and numbers of animals. So given that seagrass is a great carbon sink, as is kelp, would you agree with me that rewilding doesn't just end at our coastlines, and given that seagrass may even be a great fertilizer, it could work as a solution all round to help us with this issue that we have?
Great question, thank you. Any other questions from the audience? We've got one at the back. Sorry, Jack, that's quite a journey.
Got your steps in.
Sorry, my fault. Hi, my name's Anthony Breach. I'm a senior analyst at Centre for Cities, where I'm the lead on housing and planning. So I'm interested in this relationship between rewilding and city economies, as it seems to me that there's potential for a kind of grand bargain between allowing cities to grow, releasing more land for housing, for industrial land, but then also reserving much more of our countryside for nature restoration and returning it to temperate rainforest and other kinds of rural uses. But it seems to me that a lot of the vibes and the discourse around rewilding are quite anti-development. We've had a bit of discussion here about opposition to planning reform and similar. Do members of the panel think that there's a clash or a contradiction between urban growth and rewilding, or are they compatible?
Good question. You'd have enjoyed our panel yesterday on do we have more space for more homes and nature. Ruth, I'm going to go to you with both those questions, actually. First one, I know you're a scuba diver, so...
I am. Keen scuba diver, go to the seagrass.
Talk about seagrass, and if you can address the point about how we combine planning reform with nature recovery.
Not with seagrass too, or... Communities under the ocean, yeah. No, so anyway, on your question about the sea, yep, definitely. I'm a big fan of the marine protected areas. As you'll know, the UK has committed to protecting 30% of its seas as well as its land by 2030, which I think is really important and really positive. And I know there's lots of great projects going on about restoring seagrass around the UK, and I think that's fantastic. In terms of the planning, I think we have, I think your question is a really good one, and it shows the difficult tensions that we as policymakers have to deal with. It's not all one thing or the other, and that's my issue with the Attack on Nature campaign that we've seen. I think we have an even wider problem with planning in new homes, in that I think the current planning system has lost its legitimacy with the public. So certainly in Rushcliffe, my constituency, a lot of it is quite rural. So I have one big town and then I have lots of small villages. And the number of new builds we have had there in recent years has hugely exceeded the national average. People who live in the countryside because they want to live in the countryside in a rural area are seeing, for example, a 3,000 new housing estate built just down the road from them, which, you know, that does not have local buy-in. So I think we need to completely relook at the planning system. There's a lot of reforms in the Levelling Up bill, which I think go a long way to addressing a lot of concerns that my constituents have. And again, we need to watch and see what happens with that, but it's something that Conservative MPs, again, are very committed to making sure we get right. And I don't think there has to be a clash, I think is what I'm trying to say. So we've obviously seen in the Environment Bill, the government has legislated for 10% biodiversity net gain from new developments. I think that's really important, but I'd like to see us, you know, as much, I'd like to see a bigger focus on that happening on the site of that development rather than off at some site elsewhere, because we've talked about the health benefits and the social benefits of nature, and that should be something that everybody gets to enjoy.
Fantastic. Thank you. Anyone want to? Yeah, Benedict, how you know, rewilding shouldn't just be something that is confined to our remoter landscapes. We need more nature in our towns and cities too. How do we do that?
Well, I think if we can build a cultural acceptance of the 40s and the 50s back into our into our towns and villages, so places that are suitable for hedgehogs and scruffiness and bees, then that cultural mentality will slowly permeate into accepting and welcoming wilder places and less manicured places elsewhere in the UK. But from a business point of view, we've at Real Wild Estates been developing a developer's package, because we can see that homes are going to be built anyway. So ranting against the right of somebody to have a house is not something that interests me. I'm much more interested in optimizing nature in every new development. So it's not something that is offset somewhere else, but integrated into the built landscape. There's been some fantastic housing developments recently in my own hometown of Thornbury in South Gloucestershire, where they have built hay meadows, ponds, scrub, grasshopper habitats into the new housing estate in place of the usual glyphosated lawns and sterilised green habitats that look green but contain absolutely zero in the way of life. So I think with the right know-how, ecological businesses and developers should be working together more closely, looking at how we can maximise bioabundance on people's doorsteps, because it's only when children get into nature that we begin to see a much greater acceptance of nature in our wider society.
Fantastic, thank you. Right, back to the audience. Have we got any more questions? Yes, Jane McBean at the back.
I can't let Joe have all the fun. So I'm a Buckinghamshire councillor, but also a town councillor. So at town level, we're doing some really good work in introducing wildflower verges and lots of small projects that have a great cumulative effect. I also sit on planning for the unitary authority. We need help through law much more quickly. It's going to take us 5 years to build a local plan. While I've been sat in this meeting, my residents are emailing me to say a developer has gone in, cleared a huge swathe of Greenbelt and AONB because they want to bring an application forward. Hopefully our planners will never approve it, but we've just lost all the biodiversity on that site. So it is a plea, if we're looking at planning reform, we need supplementary planning documents as quickly as possible to set rules to stop them, and they will find ways to get round the 10% biodiversity gain. So it's more of a plea, really. And I don't know, Ruth, you may well be involved in bills coming forward. How do we put in a short-term measure to help local authorities stop the rape and pillage of the few green spaces that we have in built-up areas?
Fantastic, thank you. Any more questions from the audience? Otherwise, I will. Yes, yeah, sure.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask. What more can we do to try and inspire young people to get involved in rewilding and nature restoration? Because one fear that I've got is that we have a serious lack of green skills to help with this agenda. You know, I think what we've got to do is we've got to try and encourage and inspire young people in our rural communities to get on board with this.
Fantastic, thank you. Right, Ruth, I'm going to go to you with the first question on preemptive clearing. How can we prevent that?
So I think Jane has just made my point about the planning system having lost its legitimacy perfectly and better than I could. I'll be honest, in terms of the actual regulations around preemptive clearing, it's not something I know a huge amount about, but it's certainly something I'll be looking at as the Levelling Up bill goes through. I do agree with you that we need to change things as soon as possible. It has been regrettable but inevitable because of the change of administration that the legislation has been somewhat delayed. I am kind of pleased it was delayed from the original document, white paper about planning and this idea of zonal planning throughout the countryside, because I think the Conservative Party, Parliamentary Party's planning concern WhatsApp did go into meltdown when that came out, and I do think that probably would have been not a good step forward. In terms of young people and skills, I actually think that there is a stronger awareness and support and commitment towards the environment from young people than almost any other generation. Like when I go into schools, I'm always asked questions about the environment. There's always some sort of environmental committee for the school. It doesn't, you know, whether it's primary or secondary, they're always looking at ways they can improve the school environment and create sort of habitats on site for animals. So I think there's a really strong awareness amongst young people. I think your point about the skills and eco-careers is a really good one. I think there's a huge amount of enthusiasm, but it is quite a new industry. So I think we definitely need to do some work with people like Benedict who are working in those industries to make sure that we are, you know, giving really good information about the huge range of options that people have available. And as I'm actually talking, I think that Chester Zoo do something really good that we should probably hear about.
Yes, well...
No, they do. They have a young person's...
A youth board.
Youth board.
I was actually going to say in answer to that question, you're asking the wrong people. We're all old. Sorry, fellow panel members.
Ancient, mate.
You should be asking young people, and that's exactly what we did at Chester Zoo. So we wanted to know what young people thought and wanted from us and wanted from conservation. So we set up a youth board, which is what Ruth's referring to, of young people between the ages of 18 and 26, I think it was, and they shadowed our trustee board, and they've generated tremendous ideas of their own. One of the things that they did themselves, really, with a bit of support from us, was actually run a youth symposium. And, you know, I've come from academia, I'm used to going to symposia and conferences, you know, with all these sort of lofty academics, but actually the youth symposium was something very different, with lots of young people who are doing really great and interesting stuff in their local communities that you never hear about. So I think actually that's the answer, is to really ask younger people themselves, and there are some great examples out there.
Fantastic, thank you. Right, I'm going to put a final question to each of our panelists and ask them to give me an answer, just 20 or 30 seconds each, please, because we are quickly running out of time. I want you to very briefly sketch out your vision for what a wilder Britain would look like in the future. Starting with you, Benedict.
Well, I would love to see more of the split we see in other countries that have actually retained much higher rural populations and rural to urban ratios that we have in the UK, where the ratio is actually very badly skewed in favour of the 82% of us who now live in urban areas, because many of our rural economies have depleted and collapsed through agricultural simplification and many other reasons. I would love to see our national parks become true beacons of ecological excellence, no different to those found in many other countries in Europe. But I would also love to see innovative regenerative farming that integrates many of these elements that we're always told are incompatible: woodland, pasture, crop creation, all in much more diversified mixed farms. I would love to see far more pigs in the outdoors where they belong. But I would also love to see a much heightened level of ecological and economic ambition, and a realization that actually restoring landscapes can really power a rural recovery in large areas of this country.
Fantastic, thank you. Ruth, A Wilder Britain.
So, in the interest of time, what Benedict said, but but with the added proviso that I would love to see more wild places, patches of land integrated into urban environments, semi-urban environments, into everybody's experience.
Fantastic, thank you. Abby, over to you.
I'd like to see farmers incentivised to move to more sustainable practices, but I do think, just a note of caution, we're talking about the balance between food and the environment. Farmers often feel that food doesn't get equivalent support just because we have environmental targets enshrined in law, and there's nothing on food, no food production target in law, so we need to make sure that the balance is actually even. And
Simon?
Thank you. Yes, I'd like to see more wildness everywhere. So, yes, I think we need a bit more ambition with some of our upland areas particularly, and, you know, some of the things that Ben was talking about. But actually, I'd like to see everybody having access to nature, to quality nature, not just, we talk about access to green spaces, but some of those green spaces are very sterile ecologically. And we know during lockdown how important it is for people's well-being to link with nature. And it's perfectly possible to allow that to happen for everybody within 15 minutes walk of their homes. So we need a bit more ambition across the board, both in urban areas and in our wilder landscapes.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, that brings this session to a close. Thank you to my speakers for their excellent contributions, and thank you to Chester Zoo for enabling us to put on this event today. The next event in this room in half an hour's time is Why Do We Bother When We're Just 1%? How can the UK lead on climate change? And if you have not already, please do sign up as a SEN supporter on our website, or there's a QR code on the leaflets. Supporters get to pitch us blogs, come to our events, and get regular newsletters from the team. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your conference.